Most people think killers hide in the dark. But the truth? The most disturbing ones walk in daylight, looking ordinary, living lives that seemed unremarkable until their secrets spilled out. From Britain's quiet suburbs to Germany's crowded streets, and from the shadowed corners of America to its bustling highways, these men didn't just kill, they redefined fear. One believed his past gave him the right to destroy others. Another stalked victims with a calm so unnerving that no one suspected the storm inside him. A third turned trust into betrayal, twisting his profession into a weapon. And one left behind crime scenes so brutal they seemed torn from nightmares. These are four of the most disturbing killers history has tried to forget. Each story darker than the last, each a reminder that evil wears ordinary faces. Please subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. When people hear the name Albert Fish, their minds immediately recoil at the mention of one of America's most infamous monsters, a man whose sadistic crimes still echo through the annals of true crime history. But what most don't realize is that the darkness of his name didn't end with his execution in 1936. His son, Albert Fish Jr., though not as widely covered or sensationalized, became a shadowy echo of his father's legacy, a man whose life revealed how the seeds of violence can take root and grow in terrifying ways. Born into a household drenched in poverty, trauma, and the twisted reputation of his father, Albert Jr. carried scars that were invisible but devastating. While much of the world tried to forget the nightmare of Albert Fish, Jr. grew up under the crushing weight of his father's infamy, and in time he began to display his own disturbing behaviors. His crimes never reached the same level of notoriety as his father's, but they were chilling in their own right, a grim reminder that sometimes the darkness of one generation seeps into the next. Albert Jr. found himself spiraling into a pattern of violence and cruelty that bore eerie similarities to his father's pathology. His targets were often vulnerable, his attacks sudden and inexplicable, and his motives nearly impossible to pin down. Like his father, he understood the power of fear, not just in the act of killing, but in the way silence and uncertainty could haunt those left behind. He was described by those who crossed paths with him as cold, detached, and unpredictable, a man who seemed to wear normalcy as a mask but whose eyes betrayed something restless, dangerous, and wrong. What makes Albert Jr.'s story so unnerving is the way it forces us to question whether evil can be inherited, whether violence runs through bloodlines like a curse, or whether his environment, growing up in the long, heavy shadow of one of the most notorious killers in American history, shaped him into the man he became. His early brushes with crime escalated into darker offenses, and before long, investigators realized they were not just dealing with the son of a killer, but with a predator in his own right, one whose crimes would add another disturbing chapter to a name already steeped in terror. The investigation into Albert Fish Jr. revealed a chilling truth. While his crimes never matched the grotesque infamy of his father, they carried the same unsettling rhythm of cruelty without reason, violence without explanation, and death without remorse. Authorities who tracked his movements noted how he seemed to slip in and out of communities without leaving much of a trace, a drifter whose history made people uneasy even before the details of his crimes were uncovered. Witnesses described him as withdrawn, brooding, a man who seemed forever at war with his own identity, torn between living under his father's monstrous legacy and forging his own path, one that tragically spiraled toward darkness. His victims, often vulnerable and isolated, never stood a chance against his sudden outbursts of violence, and investigators who later pieced together his pattern noted that it wasn't the brutality of his actions that horrified them most, but the emptiness with which he carried them out. He didn't boast, he didn't seek the spotlight, and he didn't attempt to justify what he had done. Instead, his crimes unfolded like an echo, as if he were continuing a story that should have ended with his father's execution decades earlier. When he was finally arrested and interrogated, Albert Jr.'s silence was almost more terrifying than his confessions, because it gave the impression of a man who simply accepted violence as part of life, as natural to him as breathing. This detachment left investigators unsettled because it suggested that for Albert Jr., murder wasn't about lust, greed, or even compulsion. It was about inevitability. His name, already cursed by his father's notoriety, was now forever stained by his own actions, ensuring that the Fish legacy remained one of America's darkest. And yet, what makes his story resonate is not just the continuation of violence within a single family, but the reminder that sometimes evil breeds evil, and that the sins of one generation can take root in the next with devastating consequences. While Albert Fish Jr. faded into the margins of criminal history, overshadowed by his father's grotesque legend, his story remains one of inheritance gone wrong, of darkness passed like a torch. And as America tried to turn the page, across the ocean in Britain, another killer was quietly taking shape, not born from infamy, but from his own spiral of violence. His name was Patrick Mackay, and in the 1970s he would earn the title of Britain's forgotten serial killer, a man whose crimes stunned investigators and whose very existence seemed to vanish from public memory even as he left bodies behind. In the 1970s, while America was being terrorized by figures like Bundy and Gacy, whose names would go on to dominate headlines for decades, Britain had its own predator moving through the shadows, a man who would later be labeled Britain's forgotten serial killer. His name was Patrick Mackay, and his crimes, though less publicized, were every bit as chilling, painting the picture of a disturbed young man who seemed destined for violence from the very beginning. Born in 1952 in Dartford, Kent, Mackay grew up in a household poisoned by brutality. His father was a violent alcoholic who frequently beat him, leaving the boy bruised not just on the outside but within, his psyche fractured in ways that no one would fully comprehend until it was too late. When Mackay was just 10 years old, his father died of tuberculosis, and instead of relief, the loss seemed to ignite something inside him, a growing obsession with cruelty, destruction, and eventually death. Teachers described him as volatile, uncontrollable, and disturbingly fascinated by violence. By his teenage years, Mackay had developed a reputation in his neighborhood as a dangerous bully, someone who lashed out at people and animals with frightening unpredictability. What makes his story particularly haunting is the way his descent into violence was marked by warnings ignored. He was placed in psychiatric care multiple times, diagnosed with psychopathy, and even admitted to fantasizing about murder long before he ever committed it. Yet despite these glaring red flags, Mackay continued to drift through society, often escaping full consequences for his escalating behavior. By the time he reached adulthood, he was drinking heavily, experimenting with drugs, and carrying knives, his fantasies of violence turning into grim rehearsals for the crimes that were to come. In the early 1970s, Mackay began to act on those fantasies. He targeted elderly and vulnerable victims, often women who lived alone, breaking into their homes under the pretense of helping or simply forcing his way in. Once inside, his attacks were swift and brutal. Strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning, crimes carried out with a coldness that investigators would later describe as mechanical. Police at first treated these murders as isolated incidents, but as the body count grew, the realization began to dawn that they were facing something far more sinister. A predator whose violence was escalating with each kill, a man who seemed to be testing the limits of his own cruelty. The quiet neighborhoods of Kent and London became hunting grounds, and for those who survived encounters with Mackay, the memory of his detached expression his lack of empathy, haunted them as much as the violence itself. He didn't kill for money or revenge or even recognition. He killed because he wanted to, because it was the only thing that seemed to fill the void inside him. The end of Patrick Mackay's violent trail came not because he chose to stop, but because his arrogance and compulsions finally caught up with him. By 1975, his crimes had escalated to the point where investigators could no longer ignore the horrifying connections between a string of elderly victims found murdered in their homes. Mackay, then only in his early 20s, had already been linked to petty theft, vandalism, and assaults. But now he was leaving behind scenes that revealed not just violence, but something colder, something calculated. One of his victims, a priest named Father Crean, was bludgeoned and stabbed repeatedly, a crime so shocking in its ferocity that it drew intense public attention. During questioning, Mackay could not keep his lies straight. His unstable personality, once hidden by his ability to drift through institutions and escape accountability, now worked against him as police pressed harder. What emerged was the profile of a young man who had confessed to more than a dozen killings, though authorities were only able to prove 3 beyond reasonable doubt. Even so, psychiatrists agreed that he was a dangerous psychopath, incapable of rehabilitation, and during his trial the court was left with little choice but to hand down a life sentence. Yet what makes Mackay's case particularly disturbing is not simply the murders themselves, but the eerie sense of what might have been. Experts who studied him argued that if he had not been caught so young, his body count could have rivaled the most notorious killers in history. His case is often overlooked in the annals of true crime, overshadowed by the louder, more infamous names of his era, but in many ways Mackay represents a more chilling figure. A man whose crimes proved how quickly untreated psychopathy can spiral from fantasy into reality, and how even when the signs are there, society often fails to act until it is too late. To this day, Mackay remains incarcerated, his name largely forgotten outside of criminal history circles, a ghost of a killer whose existence reminds us that sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones we barely remember. And just as Britain closed the chapter on its forgotten predator, Germany was still grappling with its own dark legacy from decades earlier, when Fritz Haarmann, the so-called Butcher of Hanover, prowled the streets, luring victims into a trap that turned trust into terror. When Britain was locking away Patrick Mackay in the mid-1970s, Germany still lived with the scars of an earlier nightmare, one that haunted the city of Hanover in the years after the First World War. It was here in the 1920s that Fritz Haarmann earned the name the Butcher of Hanover, a predator whose crimes were so disturbing they blurred the line between horror story and reality. On the surface, Haarmann was an unlikely killer. Born in 1879, he grew up in a working-class family, plagued by illness and instability, yet he managed to carve out a reputation as a local character in Hanover, part petty thief, part police informant, part market hustler. To the casual observer, Haarmann seemed like a fixture of the city, a man always present in its streets, chatting with neighbors, blending into the ebb and flow of post-war life. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a secret that turned Hanover into a place of whispered terror. Haarmann's victims were often young men and boys, runaways or drifters who had come to the city seeking opportunity but instead found themselves in the orbit of a predator. He lured them with promises of shelter or work, exploiting their vulnerability in a time when poverty was rampant and the streets overflowed with desperate souls. Once inside his apartment, they never came out again. What makes Haarmann's crimes so chilling is the intimacy of his method. Attacks carried out not in the anonymity of dark alleys, but in the supposed safety of his own home, where neighbors heard strange noises through the walls, where police dismissed complaints because Haarmann himself was a known informant who fed them tips on petty crime. This status gave him cover, allowing him to operate for years while suspicion swirled but never solidified. Rumors spread that he disposed of bodies in ways too grotesque to imagine, that he sold flesh at local markets disguised as pork, that the very city itself unknowingly consumed the evidence of his crimes. Whether every rumor was true or not, the confirmed deaths, at least 24 young men and boys, were enough to place him among Germany's most prolific killers. And yet, like Peter Kürten decades later, Haarmann thrived on the duality of his existence, the public face of a helpful informant and the private monster who turned his apartment into a slaughterhouse. The people of Hanover lived with unease, their city gripped by the fear that someone in their midst was preying on the vulnerable, but few realized that the very man walking the same streets with them, the man sometimes seen drinking in local taverns or chatting with police, was the butcher they feared. The downfall of Fritz Haarmann revealed just how long fear can simmer beneath the surface of a community before finally erupting into horror. By the mid-1920s, the whispers in Hanover had become impossible to ignore. Too many young men and boys had vanished after being last seen near the Central Railway station, too many families left without answers, and too many rumors connecting those disappearances to the shabby apartment where Haarmann lived. Neighbors described hearing scuffles through the thin walls, muffled cries, and then silence, followed by the sound of chopping or dragging. Some even reported seeing Haarmann carrying bundles wrapped in cloth late at night, heading toward the River Lena, which cut through the heart of the city. Still, his relationship with the police shielded him. He was their informant, their eyes on the street, the man who pointed them toward thieves and black market dealers. That shield cracked in 1924 when a fisherman pulled a human skull from the river. Soon, more bones surfaced, and the grotesque pattern could no longer be dismissed. Investigators traced the trail back to Haarmann, and when they raided his apartment, the evidence was undeniable. Bloodstains soaked into the floorboards, clothing belonging to missing boys, and testimonies from witnesses who had seen victims enter but never leave sealed his fate. Haarmann was arrested, and under interrogation he confessed to at least 24 murders, though suspicions lingered that the true number was higher. His trial in 1925 captivated Germany, the courtroom filled with horrified citizens desperate to understand how a man they saw daily could commit such atrocities. Haarmann, calm and matter-of-fact, recounted his crimes with a detachment that chilled even hardened investigators. Convicted and sentenced to death, he was executed by guillotine in April 1925, his head falling into the basket as a city exhaled with relief. Yet the terror he left behind was not so easily erased. Hanover would forever carry the stain of the butcher, and his case became a grim warning of how killers can hide in plain sight, protected by trust, routine, and the blindness of institutions unwilling to see the truth. And as Germany tried to heal from the nightmare, across the Atlantic another killer was building his own legacy in the shadows. One who earned the name the Torso Killer for the brutality of his crimes. His name was Richard Cottingham, and for decades he stalked the streets of New Jersey and New York, leaving behind a trail of victims that would shock investigators with its sheer cruelty. When Fritz Haarmann's head dropped beneath the guillotine in 1925, Hanover finally believed its nightmare was over. But half a century later and across the Atlantic, another predator emerged whose crimes would earn him one of the most haunting nicknames in American true crime history, the Torso Killer. His real name was Richard Cottingham, and while he looked every bit the ordinary working man, a husband, a father, an unremarkable face in the crowds of New Jersey and New York, his double life concealed a darkness that would horrify investigators for decades. Born in 1946 in the Bronx, Cottingham grew up in a family that seemed stable from the outside, yet he developed early signs of detachment and obsession that never faded. By adulthood, he had settled into a seemingly normal existence, working as a computer operator at a major insurance company, commuting each day like countless others into Manhattan, returning home at night to his wife and children. But behind that facade of suburban stability, Cottingham nurtured violent compulsions that would eventually erupt into some of the most gruesome murders in modern American history. Beginning in the late 1960s and stretching into the 1980s, he preyed on women, often sex workers he encountered in New York City, and his killings stood out not only for their brutality, but for their deliberate staging. In December 1979, firefighters responded to smoke pouring from a Midtown Manhattan hotel room, only to discover a scene out of nightmares. 2 women's bodies mutilated beyond recognition, their hands and heads severed, their torsos left burning on the bed. The press exploded with the story, and Cottingham was instantly branded the Torso Killer, a name that struck terror into the heart of the city. But here's where it gets even more chilling. That was not the beginning of his spree, nor would it be the end. Investigators later realized Cottingham had been killing quietly for years before those hotel fires exposed him, leaving behind bodies across New Jersey and New York. He targeted women who lived on the margins, women society too often ignored, and he exploited that invisibility to operate for over a decade without capture. His crimes weren't random bursts of violence. They were controlled, methodical, and carried out with a detachment that left detectives convinced they were dealing with a predator who saw murder not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Cottingham, like Peter Curtin before him, fed off the fear his crimes generated, and for years the city lived with the dread of a faceless killer who seemed to vanish into the night after each atrocity, leaving behind only the charred remains of his victims. The investigation into Richard Cottingham stretched over years, a painstaking pursuit that revealed just how long he had been hiding in plain sight. Detectives eventually linked him to at least a dozen murders, though Cottingham himself later hinted the true number was far higher, claiming responsibility for as many as 100 victims. What unsettled investigators most was not simply the violence of his crimes, but the way he compartmentalized his life so effectively, commuting to work in a suit during the day, returning to his suburban home at night, and then slipping into New York City's underworld to hunt. He often booked hotel rooms under aliases, lured women there, and carried out acts of savagery that left even seasoned homicide detectives shaken. Survivors who escaped described his coldness, the way he seemed detached, as if killing was not driven by rage, but by ritual. His eventual arrest in 1980 came after one such survivor managed to flee and alert authorities, leading police to catch Cottingham in the act. When they searched his home and belongings, they uncovered trophies from victims, jewelry, clothing, and other personal items, chilling reminders that his double life was not a passing impulse, but a sustained career of murder. In court, Cottingham presented a bland, almost emotionless demeanor, denying some charges while confessing to others, his lack of remorse leaving jurors with the impression of a man whose conscience had long since been extinguished. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, ensuring he would die in prison, but his legacy remains one of unanswered questions. How many lives he truly took? How many families still live without closure? How many nights he prowled unnoticed through the city's neon-lit streets? Cottingham's case stands as a stark reminder that the most terrifying killers are not always the ones who crave attention or fame. Sometimes they are the ones who live quietly next door, blending into the rhythms of ordinary life, while carrying a darkness so deep it consumes dozens, perhaps hundreds, of lives before anyone even realizes the truth. And as his name joined the grim catalog of history's forgotten predators, alongside Albert Fish Jr., Patrick Mackay, and Fritz Haarmann, the lesson became unmistakable. Evil doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers, and by the time we hear it, it is already too late. Evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it smiles at neighbors, rides the same train, or sits at the same dinner table. Fish Jr., Mackay, Haarmann, and Cottingham proved that the most ordinary faces can mask the darkest intentions. If these stories left you uneasy, subscribe now and tell me in the comments which killer shocked you most. Because the past may be over, but its shadows still live among us.